Hello and welcome to a special episode of our video podcast series. So with me today, thankfully as always, Rodrigo. How you doing, Rodrigo?
Jim, very well. What about yourself?
I'm doing well. I'm looking forward to this one. So this is going to be an educators focused conversation here, and not just educators, but really anybody who's out in the beneficiary discovery world. This is going to be focused towards that getting out of the classroom. So what we're going to be focusing today is the idea of implementing a discovery lab, is what we're like to call it, in your H4, your mission driven entrepreneurial program. So I think this is going to be an interesting conversation because, Rodrigo, and I'd love to get your thoughts here. One of the things we see consistently in the classroom, or we're talking with these entrepreneurs, is that they're not leaving the classroom. Or if they are, they maybe are not equipped with the skills they need to go and successfully capture data
Yep.
during an interview. So I think this is a big need within the community. And obviously we're recording an episode about this, but I'd love to hear some of your thoughts as we kind of, cue this up.
Yeah, no, I think there are two levels that are really important of what we're going to be talking about here today. One is, as you said, and this is relevant for anybody performing a discovery effort and going through a H4 like process of getting out of the building and getting the information that you need from your beneficiaries or customers or whatever you want to call them in order to get the information you need to improve the quality of your service or product, right? That's one level, which literally is how to conduct good interviews, right? So
Right.
what do we
Yeah.
do in order to get out of the building and get better at this? And it's interesting because that's mostly an executive function, right? It's the capacity to organize. So there's the preparation of the interview. So get the phone calls, get the right people, know who to call,
Right.
Zoom, whatever. Then prepare for the interview. And this actually is going to be kind of part of the crux of what we're discussing, which is much more than just running market research, right? You want
Absolutely.
to
Yes.
build, measure, and learn, and building is important here. And then, of course, after the interview, how do you gather your data? What kind of processing you do? How do you transform your canvas and pivot towards whatever you need to? But then there's a second element, right? That's one. The other is as educators or managers, right? So,
Right. It could be either or. Sure.
yeah. How do you run a experience for people to get better at this, right? As an
Right.
educator, we call it a lab, right? So an interview lab within your class. As a manager, it might be a series of events or a constant, a continuous improvement program. So your team gets much better at the jobs required in order to perform successfully interactions with your customers to gather information, right? This is different
Absolutely.
it's not about to sell them stuff. It's not about to this is specifically with the objective of learning what I need to know in order to build, measure, and learn, right? To get
Yes.
better. So that's, I think, the two elements that we decided to go. It's mostly geared to people who would be in a training or education position, right? So but certainly anybody with decision making authority, managing a team, when you're asking them to get out of the building, well, the question that I would ask is, have you given them the tools to be successful when they do that? And Jim, I know you are, and you are giving them those tools. And
Yeah.
I would
Yeah.
love to start that conversation, right?
Yeah, no. So, it's interesting. You bring up too, Rodrigo, talking about individuals who are managing teams. This to me always comes back to a core tenet of success in any work environment is communication, right? And I think that one of the things that I've noticed by being in the classroom for as long as I have now is communication's a struggle for even the best of us. And
Yep.
I think those of us who've been in industry or teaching a long time, we make this assumption that people just know how to, be an empathetic listener, be an active listener. It's just not true in my experience. And I know, Rodrigo, you've mentioned that to me as well, that it's not true in your experience. So, okay, well, what does that mean to us as facilitators, as educators, as managers? Well, we have to start providing the skill sets and teaching individuals how to actually work with one another, how to actively listen in order to problem solve. And I think that to me is where it comes back. It's not some, like, I think the interviewing, the getting out of the building part is really easy for us to kind of pick on as being the primary reason you have to get good at this. But it's not just the reason. And I would actually even say that really the reason is it's communication 101. And that's where I always come back to what has made my students successful in the H4 course has been what we're going to talk about today is setting up an interview lab. So you mentioned like why am I doing this? It's because we have to add value to that student experience. You cannot expect them to just be able to go out and conduct a quality interview. It doesn't work like that. I mean, even if you think about it, let's just say that you've never, gone out to do beneficiary discovery. I'm willing to bet that everybody listening and watching this has interviewed for a job. Getting good at that's a skill, right?
Yep.
You run mock interviews. Like, think about your university as they're preparing your students to graduate. They're doing these things. This is an opportunity for us to prepare them that much better for what's to come when they do get out of the building, whether it's after graduation, an internship, or in the case of my teaching work is hacking 4. So to me, that is the reason, and that's the value of having a discovery and interview lab as part of your pedagogy. And I would tell all of anybody who's listening to this, watching this, do this early. This shouldn't be a week 5 or 6 or 10 thing. This should be week 2, week 1, depending on how you get it. Let the students immerse themselves in the skill set so that, in my case with the flipped classroom, they're out demonstrating their expertise with this and building on it week after week after week.
Yeah, I think this is so important, and I would love to gather your opinion on this, because I know you have been running a very successful interview lab for a while now in your teaching. But I remember how telling was for me. So I'm at JD, right? I train. I'm a lawyer in Mexico. I passed the equivalent of the bar exam down there, and one interesting thing is that when you go to a law school, almost anywhere on the planet, and I've been in many countries in law schools, there's always 1 or 2 or more classrooms that are made to be a mock-up of the court room, right? So
right, sure, makes
because
sense.
you're going to run your labs, right? So, and you're going to have a mock-up trial, depending on the legal system of your country, that will look differently. But in general, there's a moment in the training of lawyers where, especially with oral systems, like in the United States, less in Mexico, though Mexico is making the transition, different conversation to have.
One day.
Yeah, so and it's relevant, but we can about institutional transformation. But there's a moment in which it's not enough just to talk about something; you have to try it, right? And this is how you train lawyers. And then I remember going to anthropology departments and looking at how they would be trained. Some students, not everyone, but some students how they would be trained on how to conduct a field interviews. And 99% of the class was all about the theory of the interview, not the practice of it.
Right. Yeah.
It's almost like reading for 6 months a book of how to play the piano without ever touching one, right? And that's not how you learn, right?
No.
So labs are made for you to interact with the material. So Jim, you instituted a lab in your teaching experience. Is not part of the traditional way in which we deal with hacking for defense programs. Why?
Yeah, so I think I'm going to be advocating that it becomes one, just based on the experience here. So I think that's what it does. Why I'm going to be doing this. Why is this so critical in my experience to have an interview lab? And I want to give some credit here. So I have 2 women, Pat and Jenny. I hope that you're listening to this at some point, that have brought this to RIT, where I work as an adjunct, and they run it. Now, they are qualitative research experts. I am a qualitative researcher by trade. I'm not as good at discovery as they are. So I bring in people who really know what they're doing, that have an anthropology or have a UX background. So there's one of the things that I would suggest is, I'm not suggesting that we all have the expertise in everything that we're teaching in an H4 class, because there's so much going on in there that's not a traditional classroom. Like, hey, you're a calculus professor, calculus. You might have multiple levels here, but this is a very different skill set. So I think, bringing in individuals that know what they're doing. And then why is this critical? To your point here, Rodrigo, is one of the pieces that's really important as you're going through your discovery is you have to identify the right people to talk to. And when students have a foundational knowledge of what that looks like, using a term that we're probably all familiar with, like snowball sampling. Well, what does that mean in practice, right? You've read the textbook, you've read Yin and Steak, you know what this looks like. Well, what happens when you do it in person? So what they do is they help understand, identify the right beneficiaries, but then also the right questions to ask, right? So you want to be careful, for example, about if you're asking a yes or no question, make sure it has a purpose, that it's leading you somewhere. Because oftentimes students, in my experience, they'll just get a very casual response and then they'll stop. Well, dig a little bit more. This is an opportunity to learn how to do that. If you're going to use a yes or no question, use it to springboard to something else and be able to come up there, come up to whatever data elements you're fishing for in there. This is also this interview lab is really predicated on the idea of active listening. And the way that I frame this when anybody's asked me about what does active listening mean to me is, are you listening to listen or are you listening to respond? Those are two very different things. And I would challenge anybody who's watching this, listening to this, to think about in their own lives. And I use as personal examples. You have a girlfriend, a boyfriend, a spouse, a parent, whatever it is. When you're listening to them talk, is your brain going to, what am I going to say back to them? Versus I am listening to them to capture information to really understand what their pain points look like. And I would say that the majority of our interactions as people tend to be on the former, right? We're listening so that we can provide a response back. Think about a conversation with your spouse in the last week. Were you listening to them, or were you listening so you could tell them something? Very different, right?
So how? Yeah. So given that those guiding principles,
Yeah.
how does it look like? So why call it a lab? Why is not just a normal lesson, right? What is the thing that makes this subunit in your program a unit of analysis on itself, independent of or complementary to the rest of the Hacking for teaching experience?
Yeah, I think that's a good question. So the reason we call it a lab, it's very experiential. And I think that's one of the key hallmarks of the H4 experience, right? So students are, we're not lecturing at them. Now in the interview lab, there is an element of that. And the reason is because we want to be able to walk them through certain videos or exercises. And we're going to provide some links here to take a look at. But the reason we do this is the students have to experience a good interview, a bad interview. So for example, the Pat and Jenny come in and they do a great series of discussions
So
around things and getting people involved.
so
And then
they
we move
come
into
there.
practical.
They
Yeah,
don't teach normally with you, right? They just come
no,
for this specific event,
that's
right?
right.
So
Yep.
okay,
Yeah.
and then
And then, so there's let's just say we've got 3 hours in my class, and let's say we're going to spend an hour kind of going through a traditional lecture. Okay, it's not terrible. If you think about it, we've said in longer lectures, if you've got a 4-hour course, you probably had one where it was 4 hours of lecturing. Students get some background information. We're getting into a little bit of the theory, again, which I think is important. There has to be but then the practical application of how to do these things. Then there's a quick break, we reset, and then there's a couple of demonstration videos that the students get to watch, just snippets, right? And what was good about this interview? What was bad about this interview? What would you do differently? And really being able to get them talking and figuring out, what did you see about this? And having them self-reflect on themselves. And then the next thing is going to be is actually the practice. After we go through all of this, we finish the class with a practical exercise, a couple of them. And this is a really neat one, Rodrigo, I think, and I can talk through it real quick. So there's we give them 10 minutes to do this twice. The first time, the question is, can you tell somebody about your phone, your mobile phone, which I think we can all kind of understand, right? You might be able to tell somebody the make and model, but the difference in this first time is no phone in your hands. You can't show it to anybody. Put it face down on the table in front of you. Leave it there.
interesting.
10 minutes to talk about your phone. Okay. So then we say, now we're going to repeat the exercise. We're going to flip positions. You're going to have somebody you're going to change who's interviewing and who's being interviewed. And now bring your phone out. And I want you to ask the same questions. That's one of the pieces of this. And why is that? Why is it such a powerful thing? One of the things that we always, at least in my classroom, that I always tell the students to do, especially as they get later on the semester, bring something with you to an interview that you can show somebody, that you can walk them through a workflow, or if you have an MVP that you're working through, to be able to show them.
And that workflow would be the MVP, right? This is such an important part compared to just an interview, right? What you just said, Jim, is it's the power of Lean. Sometimes is underscored how important it is to show and tell, right?
Yes,
to be able to show and listen, right? So.
Yeah, and that's what's interesting, and so after we do that, again, there's a lot of interaction during these, right? And I'll walk around the room and listening to the different interviews and the things that the students are doing, and what you find when they're actually able to use their phones is how much more engaged they are with the questions and engage with one another. That's fascinating. Right now, again, I'm not going to sit here and make some anthropological claim about the differences between these two, and I'm sure that somebody has at some point. But this underscores the reality that we experience in the Lean Launchpad world about that MVP is a show and tell. To your point, Rodrigo. So when students have something they can show, and they might have 3 or 4 different iterations, they can walk through with their beneficiary and say, okay, well, so we've got this MVP, and we've talked to a dozen people so far, and we've got these steps, but is there anything about this that you like? And you've walked them through it at that point. It's like, that last step makes no sense because you would really have 5 things ahead of it and you're missing some detail here. Oh, great. Okay. And then you go and now you've got, what am I testing next week? I just got feedback from this beneficiary about these 5 things that are missing out of this. We're going to reformulate this MVP. And now we've got something new to talk about with the next person we're talking to. That's powerful. And I think those little tiny things that happen during this discovery lab give the students different tools about that process. But then I know we'll get to this at some point, is the idea of, well, what do you do with all of that data? How do you find themes? Now, again, qualitative researchers, we know about data saturation. We know about all these things, but this isn't that necessarily. You're looking for saturation points, but you're not looking for it in the way that you would as a traditional academic exercise, I don't think.
So how long does one of these labs last? What is the length normally, and how is the time distributed? You used the example of the cell phone,
Yeah.
but there are other. I assume there are other exercises.
Yes,
So
there are.
how long does the framing of this thing last, and then what kind of exercises? Where did you get the inspiration for those exercises, or your co-instructors? Where
Yeah.
do they get them from?
So
for faculty to know where to find good material and kind of put together something.
So again, mentioning that I've got people who that come in and teach this class specifically that have this background, thankfully, right? So they've done more interviews than I could ever fathom. But I think one of the so the class would say I usually have my class is 3 hours. The interview lab takes about 2 to 2.5 hours, the way that we have it constructed currently. It could be done in, if you've got 2 1.5 hour blocks, or you're being two, I think you could absolutely accommodate that. But there is a little bit of discussion, lecture in the beginning, right? So like I said, maybe about an hour, but it's a lot of, it's not just lecturing like you think about. It's lecturing with a lot of questions and interactions and getting the students involved with it. And then we go through and we do the mock so they'll have the videos that we watch. There's a series of 3 to 5 videos that the students are going to be watching that we ask and solicit feedback. And we'll be providing some resources to this for faculty, but having good examples that the students can see. And then after they see those examples, talking about them. So what are we trying to get? Because one thing to watch a video, but it's another thing else entirely to say, okay, well, what points did you take away from that? What was good? What was bad?
What are the videos? What are the content that you imagine that you normally put in front of the? Are they proprietary, or this is something that anybody could use? They're not,
and we can actually share the links to these. They're available on YouTube. Thank goodness for the YouTube and open source materials like this.
Oh yeah.
But one of them is a bad interview. So it's the same 2 individuals, and the person who's conducting the interview is doing everything possibly that they can do wrong to demonstrate what not to do. So it's like an exaggeration. I think it is, but maybe now being called, but maybe it's not. I'm sure somebody's going to watch that video and be like, no, that's probably been my experience with somebody.
I've done all of that. Yeah.
Yeah. So what not to do is almost as important as what to do. So we go through and say like the video is 14 minutes long. I'll have the students watch 5 minutes, right? They don't need more than that. You pick out those things that are bad habits, bad communication skills, whatever it is, talking over somebody, not letting them finish a thought, not letting there be space in a conversation, right? When you're being an active listener, silence is a good thing. Let somebody collect their thoughts, for example. So picking out, again, beyond what can I see visually? The person's not paying attention to me. The person is not letting me speak. They're making assumptions. They're asking leading questions. It's all these things are captured in 5 minutes of the video. But it's more than that. What's the person's body language look like? What kind of questions were they asking? What was their demeanor as they were interacting with somebody? It really goes on to like a lot of aspects. And then the next video is quite literally the person doing it by the book right. What does that look like? What does space look like? What does being an empathetic listener look like? Things that we don't necessarily call out in conversation typically, the students start paying attention to because they're able to see both sides of that coin.
Do you talk about the differences between doing the interview face to face versus, let's say, Zoom? Right, you talked about silence. Right now we're
Oh yeah.
conducting this interview, you and I do it here. There's always that awkward half a second time that it takes for the speed of light to go from one
Yes.
side of the country to the other. And
Yes.
our listeners might heard us, from time to time we step in each other's toes
We
when you're talking. The worst one in virtual environments is when you think the other person has finished the idea and then they continue and you had started. So
yes.
do you make some of those comments regarding how is it in this post-pandemic era to
Yes.
conduct your interviews on Zoom?
Yes, absolutely. And that's a big component of it. And I think again, giving that space, right? Letting somebody uh so you ask a question and let there be silence. There was a study, and I know the information. I don't know what the link is, but typically Americans are uncomfortable with silence beyond 3 seconds. So think about that. You've had a conversation with somebody. 3 seconds is not a lot of time, but we feel uncomfortable with that. But in a beneficiary discovery session, silence is a good thing. Usually it means somebody is thinking and they're going to provide a thoughtful response. So what we teach the students to do is to listen, have that silence, have that pause, let somebody grapple with their thoughts and come back with it. Maybe more than 10 or 15 seconds of silence, you're trying to figure out this person's not going to reply to me. And you can, hey, did the question come through? Whatever. But, having like thoughtful nudging, but being comfortable with the uncomfortable. And that is beneficiary discovery, right? You're talking with somebody that you don't know. You're talking with somebody about information that you're not fluent on at that point. It can be very difficult. It can be very, and I've noticed with the younger generations of students I've been teaching, it's very, very uncomfortable for them to do these things. So expecting those awkward pauses, which really aren't awkward. It's a time for them to be able to think, the person who's responding. It's also a time for the student to be watching body language. Is this person sitting on, just sitting here and I'm typing on my computer, I'm not watching you, I'm not listening to you, am I disengaged from all of it? You can pick up on body language, not as well on Zoom as you can in person, or any of the video conferencing softwares, but you can pick up on those subtle cues we pick up in person over video. So teaching the students to watch out for that too, because if you've got somebody who's sitting here like this the whole time as they're talking to you, I don't need to be in person to know this, to know that that they don't probably want to be here right now. Versus when I talk with Rodrigo, I can see that we're engaged with one another. It's a pleasant
Yep.
conversation. It doesn't feel awkward. We do definitely encourage students to pick up on those subtle emotional changes that are coming from the people they're interviewing and understand about where they're going. Because just like with anything else in typical qualitative data collection, this individual is consenting. That consent can be revoked at any point in the conversation if they feel uncomfortable, whatever it is. And having the students pick up on any of that in the moment. And typically what we do recommend, and this is something that goes beyond just why we're doing this, is having a buddy. One of the students that are in there with you, even virtually, to pick up, to be taking notes, they can Slack their peer colleague and say, I think this person's done with us here, or whatever, and being able to pick up on that and still maintain getting the information you need and move on while that person is still willing to provide information back to them.
Fascinating, yeah, and I completely agree with you. You even for students listening to us right now, let me give you a tip. Or your faculty notices when you are not paying attention, right? So we've
Yes.
developed now enough familiarity with virtual environments that I know when you are on Facebook or on Instagram instead of listening to the class. We see the pupil movement, you see the
Yes.
reflection, right? So it is true that you get better, and these are the cues that maybe in February 2020 you would have not noticed, but after doing this for 3 years or 4 years or whatever
Hmm.
time, you got better at it. So that's a great point, that even on Zoom, you'll find that there are other things. As you say, you don't have the three-dimensional presence that you would have on a face-to-face, but you will get other elements that will tell you if you are losing the attention or if they're uncomfortable, and all of those are important data points. So okay,
Yes.
I've never conducted one. I You convinced me, Jim, that I want to run an interview lab. What are
Great.
some suggestions that you would give me so I can put it together at the beginning of my class? What should I do
Well, I think the
to
first
put
thing
that thing
is
together?
ask yourself, am I the right person to do this? Have the humility to ask yourself that question.
Hell
And
no. The answer to that question is always no.
right. Okay. So, all right. So you've got you can do everything. Good. So that's good. But I think that's the first thing I do is ask, am I the right person to do this? And I do this in H4. I bring in subject matter experts along the way, because while I'm really good at facilitating the course, I know that I don't know everything. I'm not an acquisitions expert, or I'm not a change management expert, whatever the students are going through. So ask yourself the question, am I the right person to do this? Some of you, the answer is going to be yes. And that's great. Could I run the Discovery Lab by myself? I could, but would I do as good of a job as Pat and Jenny who come in to help me out? Probably not, because this is what they do for a living. So I think asking yourself that question, but then also with anything else, it's got to be well organized, right? You have to have everything like, okay, I've got a 3-hour course. We're going to do X, Y, and Z, and make sure that the students have access to the resources that they need. Don't assume that everyone's bringing a laptop with them, or assume anything. So make sure that it's well organized. I have all the elements I want to put in here, and we're going to provide some resources in our Knowledge Hub for all of you who are watching and listening to this, to be able to access some ideas and some frameworks that could support you doing this. Organization is key. I usually also suggest to keep your students in their student team, or around that student area, have a buddy, whatever that may look like. But that organization aspect and having all of those different resources that they need that they can carry with them. And that includes, ideas like the interview prep sheets that we would do, like a document we have, so the students can capture information, any of the resources and things that they may need. So make sure you're thinking about all of that. How are they taking notes on this? How are they organizing it? What tools are we using for organization? I know we didn't talk about data review here, but this is really, really important. So giving them all of those things up front, here they are. We use in my courses, so a version of whatever learning management software you have it in there. Have a tab in your virtual classroom for interview resources, and just dump everything in there. Be prepared for the course so that the students have everything they need, whether it's capturing the data, having example questions, examples of what a good value proposition canvas may look like at the end of this, examples of a MVP iteration from previous semesters. Because again, my recommendation is do this very early. Your students may have only just looked at the mission model canvas by this point. Maybe it's just on their first draft. They don't know the boxes. Provide some resources and a framework for them. Again, we provide at Common Mission Project examples of these from student teams that have been very successful. So organization, having the right resources for them at every point along the way. So that's number one.
What's number two?
Number two is a variety of activities and exercises. So this is not, in my experience, one of those things that you can just tell somebody about. I think it's great that we provide foundational theoretical knowledge when it comes from whatever field of study, psychology, anthropology, human-centered design, whatever. Make sure that the students have experiential learning with this. So this is why it is a lab. Now, it's not a chemistry lab where we're going to see if we can make the biggest flame at the university, but it is a lab from a practical perspective. So we want to make sure that we have exercises that are allowing students to get out of their comfort zone, because in my experience, especially with my student population that I teach, they don't do this. They're very uncomfortable with the idea of interacting with people that they don't know.
Yeah. And it's very behavioral.
Yeah,
right?
it is.
So
make sure that you're providing this. Your classroom has to be a safe spot for these students to screw up and to make mistakes and to do things incorrectly to learn from. And that's what this interview lab is, okay, I saw you do these 5 things. 3 of them were outstanding. 2 of them were not so much, because, Rodrigo, you're mentioning about over Zoom, about the body language from the person that's responding. Your body language as the interviewer's of equal importance.
Correct.
How much comfort are you putting your the people you're talking with to, when you, depending on how you're bringing yourself. So again, if I'm sitting here like this and I'm interviewing you, I'm already sending you a message I don't want to be here. So we're picking up on these things and all this different stuff. Now, thankfully, I come from the background that I watch people do that, coming from military, always keeping your head on a swivel, the seeing what the person's body language like from a threat perspective. This is not threat, but this is still like, am I actively disengaging myself with my body language with the person I'm talking to, so I can watch. I had an
interview recently, and the interviewer kept going to his phone, and it clearly was not in order to take notes. It was either looking at his phone to see the time, or I scrolled through his messages, and you can see when people are not paying attention. It was very uncomfortable, and I was not happy, and I made everything I could to finish that interview as fast as I could, right?
Yes.
So certainly it is part of your job as the interviewer to demonstrate interest. And the same goes in Zoom, by the way. As I said
Yes.
before, I can see when you are scrolling and not paying attention to my answer, and it's really easy to do that when you are recording the interview. You hit the record button on Zoom,
Yes.
and you think that takes the omen or the weight from you from paying attention, and nothing could be farther from the truth. So you're
No.
completely right. So
Yeah, again, it's very interesting things that students or people who are not comfortable or familiar with this, how much they learn from being able to see and getting that feedback. And again, I mentioned this about that, but it's got to be a supportive environment, right? These oftentimes, these students have never done anything like this. This
yep.
H4 program in particular is so different. So again, as we mentioned in one of our previous episodes of talking about feedback, faculty has to be present. And one of the reasons I actually like bringing in guest lecturers for this particular lab is because I can be in the back. I can provide some feedback and suggestions along the way. It's very interactive, but I get to watch and I get to be walking around the classroom and being kind of disengaged from the teaching process from the front of the classroom and being very much involved with what the students have going on in the classroom setting. So that's where I think that you have to let the students go through this experience. And it's fun. And I think what I see when the students are doing this well is they're engaged, they're having good conversations, and the room gets louder and louder and louder. And because they're able to start figuring out, oh, this is comfortable for me. This can actually be a really fun experience, because when you invest yourself in what this person is talking about and showing them that you care about what they're doing, it's a really fun and interactive process. I think it's one of the reasons I love doing this podcast with you, Rodrigo, is we have that energy back and forth with one another where it's a very engaging thing. It feels like a conversation, not something I'm doing for work. That is a good interview in my experience, right? Is that you have a conversation with somebody, you're leading them in some way because you have questions that you'd like answered, but you're not leading questions, to make the distinction there. But because you have a purpose to the conversation beyond just conversing. But again, the idea here is that you're showing how much you care. And when you're showing somebody that you care about what they do and their pains that they have, I can tell you unequivocally, you're going to have that much of a richer experience. Your students are going to get that much more information out because they're so highly engaged with what's going on around them during that interview.
And you said you encourage them to the show and tell, right? You encourage them to come with their doodles on a page or a wireframe and show it and get the operator. So this is more than just a conversation. You are really trying to get experiential, the user experience information that might not even be revealed through a conversation, but through a hands-on approach, right? So, how do you do that? Do you give them props? Do you get them doing that, other than the phone that you mentioned, which is, I think, a fantastic exercise?
It's a great exercise. Yeah.
How do you interact with the students so they bring their MVP game into the interview?
So silly things like, I think we're all familiar with the peanut butter and jelly experiment, right? So write down the steps to doing that. That's one that we use, right? So I'll give them, okay, this is your first MVP. Make me a peanut butter and jelly sandwich in 2 steps. Okay. And then we'll iterate. And then I said, I want you to do it in 30 steps. And they look at me like, I think you might be on something here nor there. But they start understanding that the levels of detail, the different steps and things they can actually show. So this is how I've made your sandwich. And they'll say, yeah, but there's no knife. How am I supposed to spread on here? Why do you have a fork to spread like people, like they figure these things out. So I think having just like simple drawings like that and making the students do it. We also use the Assumptions Canvas, the Johari window, which is another resource that we are able to do, is start having the students actually start putting sticky notes onto things about what they've learned from a qualitative collection perspective. So just little props like that. We encourage the students when they're talking with somebody, hey, do you have a report that you can provide to us for talking about process? Or can you show me what the software looks like? Those kind of things. And it's not only the students, the person who's doing the interviews bringing the tools, but it's also asking the person you're speaking with to have things that they can talk to as well and show you. Because again, it's like, this is my pen. Can you walk me through? Oh, I didn't realize you've got a nice flat side on here so it doesn't roll across your desk. Isn't that clever? I didn't think about that. What does that do for you? Or these kind of things. So those kind of prop interactions, it's not just, it kind of goes both ways, right? It's bi-directional. You having something to show them, but do they have something to show you? and prepping them for bringing these materials to your discussion. So little things like that we try to do. Drawing on whiteboards, right? There's all sorts of different experiments that you can do here that get students interacting with their individuals in a much more empathetic way. There's a great NASA exercise about you're crash landing on the moon and you have to get someplace. What are the 10 items that you need? And it can show critical thinking paths the students have. So any number of different exercises that exist out there, but the drawing the peanut butter and jelly sandwich process on a piece of paper, building a house. One of the things I like to do is, I ask the student, can you build a house? I've had a couple students say yes, which always throws me. And I can't. Right. Good for them. That's awesome. Right. But it throws my analogy out the window. But I said, think about this like building a house. Can you build a house right now if I ask you to do it? Again, predominantly the answer is no. I said, okay, could you find a realtor to buy a plot of land? I think I could do that. Do you think you could find somebody to dig a basement? I think I could find somebody to do that. Buy bricks to put, have a brick mason build your basement. I think I could do that. And all of a sudden you start realizing that when you break down conceptually this very big task into little pieces, they're quite capable. It's just providing the framework for them to be able to do that. And I think interviewing and data collection along the way is the same idea.
So the last step, they build the house, and I don't know how to continue the analogy from there, so I'm not even going to try, right? So what do they do with the data? Do you talk about how to effectively leverage the data that you collected during your discovery process?
Yeah, and that is, if there's like most important things, like maybe 1A through one, I don't know, D, this is up there. The biggest things that we try to teach them, and this is where I mentioned the Johari window, for example, we use something, it's kind of an offshoot of that, this assumptions canvas. And it's what the students have learned. And again, these resources are going to be available in our resource hub. Please visit the description here in this episode. But being able to throw up these sticky notes onto like, what did we learn? And using it from like, hey, here we did 10 interviews this week. Here's the 10 things we learned. And then you start to be able to say, well, that's interesting. We talked to 10 people and 8 of them said the same thing. Okay, well, that's now a known, right? We know that this is an issue. Well, these 10 things are brand new, but they're all saying them. So we haven't validated necessarily with beyond these 10 people, but we need to research this more. And here's the things that we talk that nobody cares about, right? Anybody who's done research, right? You think somebody's going to care about something, and then you realize through data collection, they don't care. And that's one of the ways that we do that. And then from there, it's using the lean launchpad tools like the mission model canvas, like the value proposition canvas, building out the MVPs, looking at the mission model canvas to determine where we have saturation points. And I do use that term, even though it's not a traditional qualitative research course, in order to inform where they have to go. And this way, the students are actually able to visualize. I mean, there's any number of different visualization softwares that you can use. Miro is the one that I typically have the students go to because it's free. And they can toss all these things up there, and then they can interact with that data together in order to find where they have saturation points. The other thing that I recommend, and I mentioned this previously, is having the students have a buddy, right? Because if you're anybody who's done a research project, and you say that you're not allowed to record, and oftentimes in the government space, recording's a no-no. So you're having somebody else in the room that can take notes down, pick up on body language. So, hey, it's interesting. This person got really excited when they started talking about this. Put that note down, right? And they can go back and say, hey, here's the notes and here's the 10 things that I noticed. And by doing that kind of buddy system, you're able to really make up for a tremendous amount of things that might have been lost in the general interaction. So that's the ways that we do that. And then I think just by virtue of the way the course is organized, they start to iterate on those ideas because they're getting assumptions challenged, they're invalidating their hypotheses. But we use that hypotheses testing and what you're planning on doing next week as part of the framework for the discovery process, right? This is what we learned this week. These are the questions we have to ask now, because the questions that are asked week to week from person to person are not stagnant. They really do evolve with the process of discovery and the data capture.
Build, measure, learn.
Build,
right? And
then measure, learn.
You learn and you build again, right? So, and this is a great point. So, Jim, thank you so much. Anything else that you think people should know? Let me put it this way. Anything else I should have asked you that I didn't? And anybody else that we should talk to about this? These are 2 questions that we frequently recommend our students to end their interviews with. So I'll say it to you. Anything I didn't ask you that I should have? And who else should they listen to if they're interested in this topic?
So I think the biggest thing that I would say that that what was asked, but maybe indirectly, is while this isn't part of the Lean Launchpad and H4 canon, this is frequently something that students do not do well. And it's not their fault. It's because they're not equipped with the
Yeah.
tools and the resources and the knowledge that this type of framework exists in order for them to go forward. So, what I would recommend to anybody who's saying, get out of the building, again, this is communication 101. How do you listen to somebody to help solve a problem instead of trying to just, get a solution in place? This is one of the predominant things that we have to teach. It cannot be the expectation that students can just do this. Now, if you have what, I take it, it doesn't even matter what major they are. We make an assumption that people can communicate and they can listen well, and it's often not the case, and it's not their fault. So this is a prime opportunity for you to intervene into a skill. And I tell my students, this program that we have curated with Hacking 4 will your trajectory will put you 5 years in the future after when you graduate, because of the skills we're teaching you. But I believe a big feature of that is not only the framework and the pedagogy around that, but is the interviewing and the being able to listen, for the sake of listening, and then going off to solve a problem, because they're doing something because they want to do the right thing, not because they want to be right. And when I'm able to get students in that mindset of doing the right thing, it's incredible what they're able to accomplish with that. In terms of people to talk to, well, I want you to talk to us. I want you to come back to Common Mission Project, and I want you to come back to our resource hub and see all
Yep.
of the things that have been curated over the course of the last several years since this organization has been around, and see what things are doing. Talk to your other faculty members. Go and bring in subject matter experts from academia, from industry, whatever you have available to you, and integrate them within your class. It's critically important that students cultivate these skills, and sometimes your usual faculty is not the right person to do that. I know this about myself, so I bring in those experts. So I'd recommend, first and foremost, reach out to us. We have made every mistake in the book regarding running these discovery labs, so
And we
we've
kept making them.
we keep making them, and we learn from them. So let us share these out with you. And I guess the other thing is, what I ask is, what are you doing that's working really well? Because I know I'm not the only one who's running labs like this. So I would love to have your feedback. I know we could probably talk about this for hours. So this is relatively short, well, relatively. But the idea here is, what are you doing, and how can it inform what we're doing to build out a more robust interviewing process for anybody who's getting out of the building, not just students, but anybody who needs to problem solve. You have to learn how to listen first, and that's the importance of having a discovery or interview lab in your H4 or innovation, or even your professional development catalog. You can't do enough development with communication.
Well, this was fascinating. Thank you so much, Jim.
Yeah, no, thank you, Rodrigo. I appreciate all the great questions and everything here. So hopefully, those who are watching this have some value that they felt that they got from this. I know that anybody who's participated in my interview lab, whether it's students or other faculty, have said, "What a great idea!" It is a great idea. So go ahead and run it in your classroom. I encourage you to do so. Let us know how it goes. All right, thanks,
Perfect.
Rod.
See you next time.
Thanks, Rodrigo. All right, bye.
Bye bye.